What is going on, everybody? Mangia Facha. This is the third time that I'm trying to record this because I didn't like the way the first two came out. It's not the problem of the material, it's the problem of presenting it in a fashion, in an order, which looks good. So this time we're going to go through the whole main line and then kind of backtrack through the different sidelines. Usually, if you've seen any of the previous volumes, I just go through the start, and as it forks off, I cover the forks, and then you get a whole picture by the time I get to the end. The Malaniuk Variation is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d, knight takes d4, and we covered the classical variations where the bishop came to c5, while the Malaniuk variation is bishop b4 check. White has several options to block the check. Believe it or not, knight to d2 works, bishop to d2 works, knight to c3 works, but the main line is pushing the pawn to c3. Black can back out to e7, but the main line is back to c5, just like the classical variation, the only difference being the pawn on c3. White has a couple options from here. The knight can jump to f5, threatening to take out the g7 pawn. They can exchange the knight on c6, or they can back up the knight by playing bishop to e3, which is the main line. Now black has a couple of replies to that, but they have to make sure that they don't leave their dark squared bishop hanging if white chooses to capture the knight on c6. Black has three main ways to do that. The first being moving the queen. The best square for her is f6. It's just like the classical variation, only white has an extra tempo. Another way is for the black knight to capture the white knight on d4. But the main line is the bishop just backing up to b6, so they could recapture with one of the pawns. White has two main moves here, but new players tend to play a move that doesn't score well. They bring their bishop to c4. Play would continue knight f6, castle, castle, knight d2, either rook e8, rook e1, and then the pawn comes crashing through the middle, or the pawn comes crashing through the middle right away. The main two moves are first, knight capture knight. They're not going to recapture with the d pawn because the whole queen exchange king capture thing, so they're going to recapture with the b pawn. Once that happens, white will also cash out the bishops, and black will recapture with the a pawn. The bishop is best put on d3. The knight is best put on f6, and then castle, castle. The knight will come to d2, and it should be a good game from here. I'm going to call it the main line. I really don't think that anyone's got an official say at this point in time, but the best scoring, very popular move is knight to f5. There are two moves for black which are played equally as often. The first being g6, hitting the knight. White will ignore that and capture the dark squared bishop on b6, and after black recaptures with the a pawn, the knight will jump back to e3. Black will develop the knight to f6, and white will push f3, protecting the e4 pawn. Black will castle, and white will push the c4 pawn, looking for a Moroczy bind structure. Moroczy bind, if anyone has never heard of that. It's when two pawns are separated by one space, and a knight is behind each of them. It's a very well-known, very bulletproof structure. After c4 is pushed, if d6 is pushed, the knight will come to c3, and after a move like rook to e8, the bishop will come to e2, and after bishop e6, castles, and that's one way it could go. Now, after c4, if black pushes d5, the pawn wants to get captured by the c pawn, and now here's a crazy looking move. It is the main line. Knight capture on e4. And after the pawn on the f file captures the knight, black will swing their queen over to h4 with check. White's only good move is d2, and now the queen will swing over to e4, capturing the pawn. If this line is deviated from in the slightest, it's not going to go good for the party that does. Bishop to d3, hitting the queen. The queen will move over to d4 to safety. And now you want to try to connect the rooks, so the queen will come out to b3. The rook will come in, attacking the knight for the second time. So your rook will come over to e1, defending it. The knight finally has a chance to get out of threat by bringing itself to e5. That whole time, it could have been captured by the pawn, but white didn't have the chance to without losing. Now the knight will come to a3. The rooks are connected, and play can deviate several different ways from here, so that's where we're going to stop this line. We're going to back up so we can finish up the other main line, and then we'll go backwards, and we'll talk about all the other possibilities we briefly mentioned, and we'll discuss them in the fullest. From here, we just discussed what happens if black pushes g6, but black can also just capture the bishop on e3, and white wants to recapture with their knight from here. Black will then bring their knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn. So you want to back up that pawn by pushing f3. Black will castle, and you want to push c4, looking to set up that same Maroczy bind structure. Black will push d6, opening up their lane for their bishop, and that's when you bring out your last knight to c3, finishing that structure. The bishop will come to e6, and that's when you bring your bishop to e2, looking to castle. If they bring their rook over to e8, there's two things you can do. This is following the main line here. You can either castle kingside, which is first and foremost the most popular thing to do, but I will mention, equally as good, you can move your queen to d2, hold out a little bit for that, and look to castle queenside. They probably are getting ready to push the pawns on the queen side for a rush, so it's really all up to you at this point in time. But if you want the safe bet, just castle kingside. And that finishes up the main line, plural, lines all the way to the end. And now we can start talking about some options that deviate from the main line, starting with move 5, when you originally get put in check, the first move of the Malaniuk Variation. Earlier, we mentioned that the way to block the check is the main line, pushing c3, but there's 3 other ways. Blocking with the bishop or knight on d2, regardless of which one you do. If they capture you, you want to recapture with the queen. So therefore, if they take out your knight, you can recapture it too. If they grab the knight and you blocked with the knight, you can fork. If you blocked with the bishop and they grab the knight, you can capture. And then when they back out, if they go c6, you want to tuck away to a3. They're going to go ahead and develop, and you want to bring your knight to c3. If they bring their knight to e6, you just want to bring out your knight to c3, and you don't have to worry about, protecting the pawn until they get all their pieces developed. Real quick, the reason why you can't fork the 2 when you got your bishop blocking the check is because queen h4 destroys it all. You got to protect your e4 pawn now. The only way to do so is with your bishop to d3. Then they can go ahead and bring their bishop to c5. So when you have to capture the knight, it's your only chance to do so in even material. They recapture. Now they're threatening on the right side of the board, queen f2 checkmate. And on the left side of the board, they're threatening queen take b2 and then grabbing the rook after. That's why it doesn't work. So if you, by chance, had blocked with the knight and they capture, it does work forking. And it does so because the knight you use to block the check also protects the e4 square, so you don't have to bring in another piece to do so. Be careful, though. Black has several options. They can capture the pawn on c3. If they do, you want to recapture, kicking out the knight. They got two squares, c6, e6. If they go c6, you just want to go ahead and protect your pawn on e4 with bishop to d3. Now, if they bring their knight by chance to e6, that's when you can bring your bishop out to c4, kind of menacing it for a little bit. If they by chance try to save their bishop, because it's not worth saving the knight, it'll fall apart, you got to go ahead and take the knight now. Because if you wait a turn, they're going to move it, and you're not going to get your minor piece material back that you lost. They will continue by snagging your d4 pawn. That's when you want to bring your bishop out to c4. They'll bring out their knight to either f6 or e7, and then you want to castle, and they'll castle. Got one more option to talk about, besides either capturing the pawn or backing up the knight. They don't have to do either. There's no rush on anything. They can do something completely different and bring their queen to e7, attacking your e4 pawn again. That's when you can bring your bishop to d3, adding a defender, and they'll remove at least one of their pieces from the fork. And they'll do the knight to c6, because when you capture the remaining piece on b4, they'll grab it with the knight. So at least they get a pawn out of it. And now they're attacking your bishop on d3, which doesn't have a defender. So they'll sneak it back. Well, you should sneak it back to b1. And then they'll get their knight out of harm's way again, bring that back to c6, and that's when you can finally castle. We have one more move to go over, and it's a doozy, so I was saving it. When you block the check with the bishop on d2, black also has that queen to e7 move. Your only move that doesn't throw away the game is knight to b5. Black will go ahead and exchange off bishops, and you want to recapture it with your knight, so you have a defender on the e4 pawn. Otherwise, the queen would come in and snag it. Now black will push d6, so the queen now defends the c7 pawn. And from here, you can bring the bishop out to c4. The knight will jump to f6, and then both people will castle. And this is how you get out of harm's way from that queen e7 move. And last but not least, before we can wrap all this shenanigans up, is blocking the check with knight c3. At this point, the analysis says it's even. It's a huge mistake for them to attempt to capture either of the knights. It would put you ahead in the whole number range. If they take both, it's the multiple whole number range. Their best bet is to go with standard development, like knight to f6. If that's the case, you want to capture their knight on c6, and they're going to capture with the b pawn rather than the d pawn, because the whole queen swap, king no castle deal. At this point, you want to focus on castling, so bishop to d2. Black will push d5. You want to go ahead and capture with your e-pawn. They'll capture with their c-pawn. You want to go ahead and castle. They'll castle. And now you can bring out your bishop to g5, pinning the knight against the queen. This is when they'll go ahead and push up c6 to protect their d-pawn. And that's when you bring your queen out to f3. They'll try to kick away your bishop with pushing h6, and that's when you go ahead and trade off. You take out the knight with your bishop,
They'll recapture your bishop with their queen. You recapture their queen with your queen, and they'll capture your queen with their g-pawn. And from here, you should have a pretty decent endgame, I would say.
Well, that finishes up the move 5 splits, and we just got a couple more moves in the middle of the game to finish up. So after c3 on move 5, the main line, they would back up to continue the main line with bishop to c5. We're going to talk real briefly on bishop to e7.
There's two main moves here for white. The first being to capture the knight on c6. Don't be surprised if they recapture with the d pawn this time, because when you go to exchange out queens, they don't have to capture with their king. They got the bishop that's on e7. Once they do that, bring your bishop out to c4. They'll jump out their knight to f6. You want to push f3 to protect your e4 pawn. They'll castle kingside, and you can castle kingside. And this is the beginning of the game where you can go from here. If they capture your knight with the b pawn, it's the same thing. You bring your bishop out to c4. They'll bring their knight out to f6. You can push e5, kick the knight once. It'll land on d5. Then you can castle, and they can castle. And this is the beginning of the game with the version where they capture with the b pawn.
Let's talk about if you grab the knight right off the bat as soon as they bring their bishop back to c5. If they capture with the d pawn, go ahead and swap out queens, and you want to bring your knight to d2 to protect the e4 pawn. They got a couple different things they could do. If they bring the a4 pawn up, you can ignore it for the meantime and bring your bishop to d3, protecting the e4 pawn. You might see them, just an example, there's different things that they can do. If they bring their knight to f6, you can bring your knight now to b3, attacking the bishop. Their best bet is bringing it to d6 because b6 will be blocking in their pawns. And once the bishop is on d6, you can go ahead and castle, and you should have a really decent game from here. If by chance they capture the knight with the b pawn, it's basically the same thing. You're going to bring your knight out to d2. The only thing you have to worry about now is when they bring out their knight to f6, you don't want to push your f pawn to protect the e pawn because their dark squared bishop would prevent you from castling.
We've already taken a look at the main line, bishop e3, and the secondary knight capture on c6. We have one more line to look at before we wrap things up, and that is knight to f5. Now, black has three main replies to this, which are queen f6, d6, and g6. First, we're going to look at queen f6. White's main reply is bishop e3, and this can go one of two ways. Either black captures the bishop on e3, and white recaptures with the knight. After that, black's knight jumps to e7. White's bishop goes to e2, and then both kingside castle. Or, if the bishop doesn't capture, the pawn can push to d6, opening up the light squared bishop attack on the knight. And if that's the case, white will capture black's bishop on c5, black will capture white's knight on f5, and then pawn capture bishop and pawn capture bishop. From here, white's other bishop will jump out to b5, pinning the knight to the king. Black's knight will go to e7, and then both will kingside castle again. That's the two main variations, and really the only two variations for when the queen comes out to f6 as a reply. Next, we're going to take a peek at g6.
There's two options from this point. The knight can jump to e3, or the bishop can go to e3. If the knight comes to e3, black's main move is f6 with the knight. And then from here, the bishop will come out to d3. The knight will go to e5, and then simply castle, castle. If the knight doesn't come to e3, as I said, the bishop does. And then there's three options from here. The first being transposing to the main line.
If the bishop backs up to b6, this is a straight transposition from the main line here. The second option I saw Nakamaro and Carlsen play, the bishop actually comes back to f8, and then the knight jumps back to d4. The black bishop kind of fianchettos and swoops around. It's like the fourth time that thing has moved to g7. White plays g3, getting ready to fianchetto their own bishop. The knight comes to f6, attacking the loose e4 pawn, but the bishop comes to g2, fianchettoing, saving that pawn just in time, and then castling. It's just an awesome little maneuvering of pieces. I absolutely love that line. And then the third option, and this is literally the last line before we wrap things up, captures. After the capture, White's knight on f5 jumps and captures the bishop on e3. Black's knight will jump into f6, and f4 gets pushed to protect the e4 pawn. Black will now castle, and White is looking to set up another Maroczy bind setup. So they push c4. d6 gets pushed open to release the light squared bishop, and now White's last knight jumps to c3. The knight that's on f6 is looking to maneuver and get to the 5th rank, so it jumps to d7, and now the bishop will go to d3. And the knight will do its last jump and land on c5, and White will castle. And rewinding. And the last but not least, d6. After the pawn pushes to d6, we have knight to g7 check. The only good move for the king is f8, and then the knight jumps to h5. The black queen goes to h4, threatening to pick up the knight. So now the knight jumps to g3. Black knight jumps to f6, and that's when we bring our bishop to e2, getting ready to castle. Now there are 3 knight moves, and we're going to go through each one. The first one is knight capture e4. We go ahead and we capture the knight on e4. Queen grabs it on e4, and then we castle. The rook now comes to g8, and we throw in a quick check with bishop to h6. The king retreats to e7. It can also go to e8, same deal. And then we bring our bishop to f3, hitting the queen. The queen's got 2 squares to retreat to. If it goes to f5, we got rook e1 check. The knight will block with knight e5. Then we can bring our other knight into d2. They're going to bring their light squared bishop to e6, and we bring our dark squared bishop back to e3. Their knight will capture ours on f3. Our queen will grab it, not the knight. Their queen will grab it, all exchanging on f3. Then our knight will grab it on f3. Their bishop will take our bishop on e3, and then we go ahead and we grab it with our rook on e3. And that's basically the end of that line. Now, the queen, we just said, went to f5. Well, it can also go to h4. If it goes to h4, very similar line. Rook e1 blocks with the bishop on e6. We still bring our bishop back to e3. Bishop on c5 will grab the bishop on e3, and we recapture with our rook. They'll block with the knight to e5, and we'll bring our knight over to d2. They'll jump their knight over to g4, and we'll snag it with our bishop. They'll snag our bishop with the queen, and now we have to push g3 because of the battery. Their queen will grab our queen on d1, and we finally grab their queen with our rook. And that's the end of the line. All aboard, all get the fuck off. That's the one move that if the knight captures on e5. The other possible knight move is knight to g4. Bishop captures on g4. Bishop captures on g4. The queen gets out of the way on d2.
and h5 is pushed to back up the bishop. h3 is pushed to kick out the bishop. Bishop goes to e6, queen goes to f4. Queen captures queen, bishop captures queen. Knight jumps into e5, bishop captures knight, pawn captures knight. Knight jumps into d2, rook goes to d8. Knight jumps again to f3, pawn goes to h4, kicking out the knight. Knight goes to f5, bishop capture knight, pawn capture knight. Or, I'm sorry, pawn capture bishop. Pawn goes to e4, hitting the knight. Knight goes to h2. Pawn goes to e3, pawn capture pawn, bishop capture pawn. And that's the line for the second one. And the third possible knight move is knight to e5. We're going to go ahead and push b4, hitting the bishop. Bishop goes b6. We push c4, looking to close in on the bishop. And the knight grabs the piece on e4. We castle, kingside. The rook slides over to g8, and we finally get to push c5, hitting the bishop. D captures c, and that's when our knight will grab their knight on e4. Queen will grab our knight, and now our queen goes up to d8 with check. And the king will go to g7, and we go to g5. They go back to f8, we go to d8. And it is a perpetual because no one wants to give up any room. And we'll end on that note. Mingya, Mingya, Mingya. That was the Malaniuk. Wow, I literally worked 3 days on this. Nothing felt right. And I know the 3 different night variations at the end kind of felt rushed, but those were the only lines that made any sense. Anything else jumped to, -2 or 3. There was no options. But I appreciate you guys, and I promise the next couple volumes are going to be a lot shorter. Promise you.